So there's a lot of different ways that we can trust people, and we're going to be looking at how did Jesus exemplify that, his trust in the Father today. And to me, it kind of came down to three main points. And so those three are, the process is learning to recognize his voice. How do we learn to recognize God's voice? Then learning that we can trust him, the experience of coming to that place. And then the acting part is acting in trust by obeying and trusting that what he's leading us to do is for our good. So we're going to take those one at a time. We'll start off with the first one. How do we know that it's God speaking? How do we learn God's voice? And it's not going to be very rocket science stuff here. It's very simple, but something that we often need reminders of, because I know I need reminders regularly, in that it's just regular time. We just have to actually spend quantity of time with him to learn to hear his voice. And a little example I have of that is there's these twin brothers that I went to high school with and who I now work with part-time at the music store. And the most common question I ever hear is like, which brother is that? It's like, okay, because it's hard to tell them apart. And the only way that I ever knew how to tell them apart, because one of them has a mole in one spot in his forehead. And so if I would walk into the store or see them at school or something, I'd look and see, and if they weren't wearing hats, then it was good. Then I go, okay, that's so-and-so and that's so-and-so. But other than that, I had no idea. Like, you tell one thing, and then next day you're talking to them, it's like, why doesn't he know what I'm talking about? Oh yeah, it's actually a different person. So I guess twins don't have instant sharing of all conversations. That's why they talk so much, I think, just so that because people probably assume they do. They talk to each other all the time. But over the last couple of years, as I started Lights, I actually was working at the music store kind of 3 days a week sometimes, and I spent regular time with them. And after regularly spending time with them, I was like, oh, I didn't have to look to see which one had the mole on their forehead. I was like, oh, I can tell the tone of voice, or slight differences in the way they look, or just their personalities. Like, you get to know which one is which. And I could tell who was talking in the other room without even seeing them. I would know which brother it was because I was spending regular time with them. So that amount of time, you get to know them. On the surface level, seeing someone once every couple of months, you don't get to that point of being able to know those subtle differences. So Jesus talks about this in John 10, and he uses the example of a sheep and shepherd. He says, I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of a sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. He knows each sheep. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice. So the second thing, after we learn to hear God's voice and get familiar with him, is learning how can we trust, how do we know that we can trust him? And that takes time and experience as well. So often it's a process. God may start with something little and a little leap of faith that we have to do, and we see that, oh, he came through and I can trust him with this, and then next time it might be something a little bit bigger. And so just like we do as we learn as kids to do things and build responsibility, sometimes it starts with a little thing and then you're given more responsibility and grows. For me, an example was when we moved to Manitoba from Ontario. Anna and I were at a reunion at Providence, and we sensed kind of like, I think God's telling us that within a year we're going to be back in Manitoba, and not just for a visit, for a longer time. She's from Ontario, but we met at school here, and it was a thing we had to kind of wrestle with for a bit. It wasn't just like, oh, okay, let's pack up and go. It's like, it took time. It took almost a year of confirmation after confirmation. It would be kind of like, I think this is what we're supposed to do. And every time that someone would share an encouragement with us or whatever was being talked about at church, it's like every single thing was like confirming over and again, yes, do it. This is what you're supposed to do. And it wouldn't go away. So it took time. But when it did happen, it was a very obvious answer to prayer, and I'll share some of that a little bit later on. So our third point is now, if we've learned to hear what God's voice is by spending time with him, we've learned that he can be trusted, we know that he's acting for our good, then we have to act. So the third point is just to act in trust by obeying. But Jesus had a best friend named Lazarus, and he had two sisters, Mary and Martha, and Lazarus got really sick and died. And Jesus was a ways away, not super far away, but it took him, he waited there until it was 4 days after Lazarus had died, and he was already like buried and in the tomb. And this was when he showed up, and they were like, why didn't you come sooner? I'm sure you could have healed him, but now he's dead and he's been buried for 4 days. But just picture this. Picture the faith and the trust that Jesus has in what God's going to do when he says this. He gets there and says, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside, and then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me. Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out! And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, and his face wrapped with a headcloth. And Jesus told them, unwrap him and let him go. The part that blows me away is that the preamble, not that, he prayed and God did it, but it's like the faith that he had to say, okay, this is what's going to happen, and this is why it's happening, so that you guys will believe, and then tell this dead person to come out of their grave after 4 days. Like, that is complete and total trust